Authority on Peace and Security. We start this hour in Geneva, where Oman's Foreign Minister, Badr Albusaidi, has stated that the United States and Iran have demonstrated unprecedented openness to new ideas and solutions following his meeting with US envoys Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner. This comes as Oman's Foreign Minister is headed to mediate the latest round of nuclear talks between the US and Iran in Geneva, aimed at resolving their long-standing nuclear dispute and averting new US strikes on Iran following a large-scale military buildup. The two countries renewed negotiations this month, seeking to break a decades-long impasse over Tehran's nuclear program, which Washington, other Western states, and Israel believe is aimed at building nuclear arms. Tehran denies this. According to reports, US Special Envoy Witkoff and Trump's son-in-law Kushner will attend the indirect talks with Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi. Joining us now to discuss this pressing situation coming out of the Swiss capital is Sol Sadka, a political commentator. He joins us live from Tel Aviv. Thank you very much, Sol, for joining us. This third round of negotiations, do you have any optimism when it comes to them? Do you think that we might reach a possible deal here? And what sides are both countries on?
It's clear, though, whatever happens, that a deal is possible. A deal is possible, but only because of the vast array of American weapons that have been built up around Iran over the past 2 months to unprecedented levels. And the question is, though, the Iranian regime that has to make a deal. So some of them are looking out at those American weapons and thinking, wow, those weapons could wipe us out within 2 days. And at that point, we will be helpless. We will be at the mercy of the Americans within 48 hours. And then there are other people in the regime who are genuine theocrats who don't actually care because they really want to go down with the ship. They believe that Armageddon is a theological imperative for them, and they want to bring that about. And the question will be not just who will have the upper hand inside Iran as they face this American weaponry. In other words, they have the choice. Do they meet the American demands pretty much in their entirety, which is to give up their nuclear program, to neuter their ballistic missile program, and stop funding their proxies? Anyway, their proxies are beyond funding. They don't have any money. And in return, they will essentially get nothing, perhaps some minor sanctions relief. Or do they go to war with the USA, who now have a vast array of weapons around them? And the decision has to be made inside Iran. Certainly Trump, who himself was the victim of at least 1 and possibly 2 assassination attempts by the IRGC in the 4 years between his 2 presidencies, hasn't got any time for them and is probably leading them down the garden path. But most likely, he is willing to make some kind of deal, but entirely on his own terms, at which point the Iranians will have to decide whether to accept it. And like we said, what it really depends on here is less about what the Americans want to happen and more about whether the Iranian regime could be sufficiently united within themselves to make a deal and survive to live another day.
And Sol, talking about uranium enrichment here, the two sides are on completely different pages. There are talks about the Iranians scaling their uranium enrichment down in a huge way. However, absolute zero, they said, is not an option. It wants to maintain its nuclear capabilities to enrich for peaceful purposes only. How likely do you see the United States agreeing to that, if at all? What sanctions, if any, would you see relieved if the Iranians do indeed agree to a total halt of enrichment?
Well, it could be. We will see in sanctions relief in stages. So if there were to be a deal, and to be honest, it looks unlikely, but if there were to be a deal, my guess is that there will be checks and balances to ensure that sanctions would be released only in return for verified success. So the handing over of the enriched uranium they already have, or its inspection by inspectors and decommissioning, because it simply could be that it's buried under a mountain and is inaccessible. And the end of their program, the handing over the centrifuges and so on. My guess is that there are people in the American administration, Rubio and even Vance, who has been seen as a kind of a dove as regards to this kind of thing in the past. They are getting into line, and they all understand that Iran's long game is to build nukes, and they are willing to play a very long game. The problem is, though, that the Iranians in the past 6 weeks have murdered over 30,000 of their own people in riots. Rioters, protesters who rose up against them with the encouragement of the United States. And it's unclear whether the United States could really make a deal, shake the hand that is that bloody, dripping in the blood of their own protesters. Can the American regime, including Marco Rubio, for example, would they be willing to shake that hand? I think it's implausible. And my suspicion is this is all a dance, and that over the next days or weeks, we will see kinetic action in Iran. But I would put that at an 80% probability. There is a 20% probability, as we have seen in the past, that some deal will be made and Iran will live to fight another day. And
Yes.
it's unclear which direction we're going in, but I would say the vast majority of the probability rests on the kinetic dismantlement of Iran's missile and the remains of its nuclear capabilities.
And Saul, how much does the domestic public in the United States have over this deal? We know that the majority of Americans, from most polls, don't support military intervention in Iran. Well, at least don't trust Donald Trump at the helm of making those decisions. We do have midterms coming up, of course, at the end of the year. Some and a lot of the American public have been rather critical of Donald Trump's foreign policy, where they asked him to stop getting America dragged into forever wars, as they put it. And so how important is the American public when coming to making that decision, do you think?
Well, the American public the American public is actually critical to Donald Trump. He has lived his life over the past 10 years in politics, very much driven by polls. He is very tied into this. So on the one hand, yes, it does appear the Americans, if you say, do you want the United States military to go to war with Iran? They will generally say no. At the same time, the post-war reviews of the 12-day war and America's brief interaction there of Midnight Hammer was very much positive for Donald Trump. It was seen as a great victory by the vast majority of the American population, and certainly the core of his party, which is what really matters to him, and certainly the centrists in America. And those are the people that he has to tie over. Ditto with the Maduro raid. The vast majority of people are in favor. It was even very hard for the Democratic Party to criticize him for that, because after all, what has he done if not arrest an evil narco dictator? So this probably would be the same kind of thing. So when you ask people, do you want to see a war with Iran? When you're asking them, do you want American boots on the ground? Do you want a protracted multi-year engagement in the style of Iraq? And the vast majority of people will say no to that. But do they care if there is a period of a few weeks to months where America is patrolling the skies of Iran and dismantling its nuclear and missile armory? Most likely, if you ask them to that question, they would not object. And assuming the battle, which seems likely, does go as well as previous engagements that Trump has engaged in, sharp and quick, proper shock and awe stuff, then most likely the American public will approve of it. If you recall, though, the Iraq War initially, back in 2003, went very well. The shock and awe game that the Americans played was extremely effective and dismantled the Iraqi regime within a few weeks. What happened then, though, however, was the interference of various militias, a lot of them funded by Iran, by the way, who made sure that the peace was unwinnable. So while America did win the war within a few weeks in a technical sense, what then dragged out was a mess of bloodshed, much of it instigated by Iran. And so this would be essentially the end of that era.
Okay.
And my guess is that Trump, and particularly Rubio and people behind it, recognize, particularly in the light of the fact they can no longer use their tariff, that was Trump's other toy, that they would like to have some kind of effect over here.
Okay, so do stay with us as we turn over to our next story. We move over to Europe, where Russia has handed over the bodies of 1,000